Good afternoon or good morning from wherever you're joining. Just going to give folks, as usual, a moment to join and we'll get started. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen with you all. And hopefully everybody can see that. All right. And I don't see any issues with sharing, so we should be good. So we're going to get started. Thank you again for joining today. We're going to go ahead and discuss configuration management. I think configuration management is one of the most important topics, both within the CMMC framework itself and just in general from a security and IT perspective. It's right up there with incident response. A lot of folks may not think about configuration management and even change management, which are very intertwined at times as being necessarily security processes and more of a business process. But as we go through here, you'll see why it's so important. And hopefully you'll start to look at your organization and see where are you doing things correctly, where do you have gaps, and how this directly impacts both your security posture as well as your ability to pass these audits that you're attempting to go through. No updates to nomenclature and assumptions. There's been no updates from DoD or the CMMC AB. No additional tidbits of information that I can find yet signifying any change. So February is still the last note that we have. And as usual, I've given you the general references. There's only 3 NIST special pubs that is used for this one. And I apologize, it should say configuration management on that slide, but only 3 that we're using. So just like our last topic, we have 9 total practices that are under the family that we're going to discuss. The 9 are listed out here. Most of these should be fairly common sense in nature in the way that they're worded. They're things that people should have seen if you're just part of any organization who deals with change and deals with configuration. We're going to dive into the details as far as what maybe you should be doing and questions you should ask. But hopefully none of the topics that you see are foreign or new to you. You've never heard of them, which will hopefully make this a little easier to go through. So starting off, we always kind of start with baseline configurations and inventories. You can look at this in different ways. Some folks will just strictly stick to baseline configurations and then monitoring those configurations. Others like to work off of hardware and software inventories. A mature organization will combine both. But the point here really is that you need to have something. You can manage things via a gold image. So, and gold image is kind of just a synonymous term that we use across multiple industries. But if I take a computer, I load it with whatever software I want my employees to have, I take an image of that so that I can restore and obviously lay down an image to any new PCs that I buy. I'll call that my gold image. And then I'm going to have some frequency at which I update that image, and that becomes my new version that rolls out. In addition, though, for the configuration management piece, the important part is to add this usually a software that will notify you or prevent a change. So as an example, I could be given a report that says all of these different files and folders changed, these new pieces of software showed up, or I could even implement a piece of software that will say, anytime someone tries to make a change, the software will prevent it and then send a notification to the approval body to say, do you allow this deviation from your baseline? You have to consider permissions, though, in this case, because here, rogue software and or hardware can be installed and implemented. So someone could be putting a piece of software on a computer. They could be putting a rogue wireless access point or access device on the network. If they've got the permissions to do that, whether they're a network admin, they have local admin privileges, whatever that case may be that grants them that level of permissions, having a software and hardware inventory, for example, may become somewhat useless. Because while you, as the security professional, are looking at this inventory, you have people who can go out behind the scenes, implement things that they want. And if the inventory isn't updated, you don't know about it. So software in a lot of cases is that solution, but I can tell you through past experience, it becomes very troublesome because not only is it going to alert you and potentially block things like a new piece of software, like something a user would put on there, but every time antivirus updates, every time a normal update occurs, every time you patch, and depending on the size of your organization, the amount of patching you do, the amount of software you have, you could be given literally, thousands, if not tens of thousands of changes that you have to either say, accept these and approve these and put them as part of my new baseline, or reject. And if you can imagine yourself as an organization, most are probably in the small to medium size. Do you have the manpower to sit and review every one of those file changes? It's not necessarily going to come up and say something pretty like this piece of software is trying to be installed. It might literally tell you every file that's changed in every directory. Again, very, very burdensome, very difficult to tell if it's something you want to do, an expected change like a Windows update, or if it's a malicious piece of software trying to modify Windows so that it can bypass security. You may have to buy software. If you're going to manage an asset inventory or have a library, it's probably okay to use something like Excel or some other spreadsheet type software when you're small. But when you start to get into hundreds or thousands of assets, and these assets include more than just your PCs, being able to track all the software, all the hardware, firmware, end of life, end of service, expiration dates for warranty, et cetera, becomes extremely troublesome. And again, it still falls back on that same problem that you have where I started, which is if someone's making changes in the environment and you don't know about it, the inventory is only as good as that snapshot in time. All of your configuration management efforts really need to be tied to change management. You'll see a lot of people just say change management / configuration management or vice versa, but they're almost considered interchangeable by a lot of folks because it's like the configuration management is what we're doing, whereas the change management is how we're doing it. And you really can't do one without the other. And you'll see that in our future slides. But if you have your own change management processes, if you have separate teams, if they have different ways of doing things, you'll definitely want to include them to get the best bang for your buck. And really at the end, I put these kind of two questions up there because this is a very difficult problem to solve in most organizations. It's very time consuming. It's not hard. We have tools and software and spreadsheets and pen and paper that can serve our needs, but it's very burdensome. So when you're looking at this and you're trying to boil the ocean, one of the questions really you should ask yourself is, are the efforts serving me to help answer what should my configuration look like at any point in time? If you can't achieve that, then no matter what you're doing, why are you doing it? It's not providing you value. And it's kind of common sense, but I put it in here anyway. If you don't know what you started with, how would you know if it changed? And then how would you know if those changes were expected and approved? One of the downfalls I've seen with this process and how time consuming it can be is that when it's given to someone as a collateral duty or an additional duty, they don't have time to do it. They're going to go through it as quickly as they can. And if presented with a set of changes, they'll just say approved. You might get lucky and the baseline is updated as a result, but realistically, no one reviewed those changes to ensure that they should be made. So over time, again, you're tracking changes, but you have no real understanding of what's changing, why is it changing, is it expected, is this good or bad for the organization? So again, you're putting a lot of time and effort to prove you're doing something, which may satisfy an auditor on the compliance side, but does very little, if not nothing, on the security side. In fact, I'd go a step further and say it could actually give you a false sense of security because you believe you have a stronger security posture as a result of this when you really don't. Some of the things that you can be doing for establishing and enforcing security configurations and settings for your organization and the products that you deploy, things like using hardening guides for operating systems, web browsers. The military uses STIGs as their guides. We use it as a verb and say we STIG a box. Anybody who's worked with DoD knows that when you take their gold image that has the STIG applied and you apply it to a workstation, we say it bricks the box because it becomes almost useless. It's locked down and hardened to a point that, it's very secure because nothing can be done. And then it becomes a business impact. So the whole point of putting these on here is to say, you want to have something at least that's a hardening guide. You probably aren't going to go to the level of STIG. We'll find a happy medium in between. And you want to look at other things like registry settings, account file and directory permissions, ports, protocols, remote connections. Don't focus solely on an operating system, a web browser, a piece of software. Look at it holistically. And a lot of times when we start talking about what should we configure, operating systems and particular pieces of software come to mind. They're just the most logical, and we'll overlook things like scanners, printers, networking appliances or devices, voice devices. So, in an organization of say 50 or more people, you're likely to have networked printers. You're likely to have a VoIP system or whatever you're using. Those also have to be hardened. Those also have to go through configuration and change management. And again, those are often overlooked. And this is where I say configuration management to me is very intertwined with change management, because when you talk about tracking, reviewing, approving, disapproving, and logging changes, you're talking about the how you do something, which in my mind is change management. In this case, you are looking at changes for both the business and security to review and approve, or you should be. So when I pose this question to you, one of the things you could be asking yourself is, does my organization even do it? And does it do it from a business perspective, security perspective, or both? And how am I doing it? How are proposed configuration changes being documented? What is that process for saying, I want to make a change next week during our maintenance window? Who has to approve the change? Is it a person? Is it a board? Is it a majority of a group of people? How have you defined that and where have you documented that? How do you present those requests for approval? It could be as simple as an email to a distro and you get approve, deny. You might have something like Jira and use a project board. You might use a CCB or CAB meeting, which is a change control board or a change advisory board, where you get on that call with the stakeholders and you discuss and present your changes, and then you get approval from the board members. Lots of different ways that you can do this, but the idea behind it is you should choose one, ideally one method. You should document who can do what, how they do it, when they do it, where does it go, and then where do you store all this stuff for future use? How do you review it after the fact? How do you audit it? How do you provide it to an auditor as evidence that you're doing things when you're going through, say, your CMMC audit? Where do you get the information in case a change was made that had a negative impact that you discovered a week later and you need to go and roll it back? All of these things need to be considered. Again, you don't necessarily have to go out and buy specialized software or spend a lot of money, but it does take time to create this, get the business to approve it, and then most importantly, dedicate individuals who are going to maintain this after the fact. There's no point building all of this out and then not using it. And one of the things that we're most curious to see in the CMMC audits, if and when they ever roll those out, is how strict will the auditors on average be? How long do you need to provide evidence? Right now, we recommend at least 90 days, ideally, 180 days or more. But for a lot of folks, this will be a new process and you just won't have that kind of time between when you implement and when you're audited. But what will the auditor expect to see? Will the auditor test you? Will they just say, show me the evidence that you're tracking it, or say, show me where it actually went through the entire process? We don't know those things yet. So I think everyone who's on the call who is in the same boat for CMMC really should take to heart that you should assume they're going to be very thorough in their approach, and that you need to have all of this in place and be able to provide that evidence. The big one here that's, I think, is probably overlooked more than anything is analyzing the security impact of the changes prior to your implementation. Normally, we would do something like a security impact analysis or an SIA. It's like a little form that the organization can come up with, a template that's given out to anyone. And when they say, well, I want to move from this product to this product because it's got all these great functions, they'll fill out the SIA that discusses things like, how does it impact the architecture, the environment? What review did it go through? Did security get a time to test it? Can they do vulnerability scans? Can they do code testing? try to vet all of this stuff prior to making the change. Some things are obviously easier than others. Some are more time consuming than others. So you have to plan for it. If you have a weekly maintenance window, then you have to have a really good process to be able to get that SIA in, have it completed, have securities buy off, go to CCB, et cetera. If you do it once a month or once a quarter, you're going to have a lot more time and the process will be simpler. But in doing all of this, you have to ask yourself as well, do you have the personnel with the appropriate levels of skills and expertise to evaluate the changes? Sending it to the security team does not guarantee that the security team understands all of the changes and the impacts those changes have. A good SIA process is actually going to involve engineers, architects, the vendors potentially, the whole organization, representatives from the entire organization potentially. Because again, these changes are going to impact more than just the security team. And probably the more obvious but kind of must-haves are, do you have test plans? Do you have rollback plans? Have you done any type of risk assessment where you can include data from the assessment itself, whether that's internal or external? But the goal here is to get as much information in front of security as possible. The impression that a lot of folks have is that security is the ultimate decision maker of whether something happens or doesn't. And in most cases, that's not true and should not be true. Security is there to evaluate and present risk and allow the business to decide if they want to accept the risk, try to mitigate it or partially mitigate it, or not inherit that risk and go a different route. So if you are working with teams that it's like, well, it gets to security and it gets blocked, that's probably something you want to look at your organization to say, is security set up in the right frame of light? Because unless there's a policy that security is following, or you're trying to violate a rule that, let's say, a government contract says you can't violate, really security is not there to block, it's there to provide an evaluation of risk. We want to look at defining, documenting, improving, and enforcing physical and logical access restrictions. This one's a little bit harder in that there's not a lot of information provided by NIST. It's a very short kind of practice, if you will, but it speaks mainly to how are you segregating who can implement changes? How are you segregating environments from a security perspective? So if I had only a single environment, which I'll just call production or prod, you may not have physical and logical segregation of the environment itself. You may have a DMZ, you may not, et cetera. But if you had multiple environments, and let's say you were developing software, so as a software development organization, you had tests, non-prod, and prod. Ideally, as you work up through the stack, you're going to have different people reviewing, making changes, and implementing. The concept behind that is we're logically and or physically segregating it so that we have separation of duties and least privilege. So maybe someone can promote all the way up through non-prod, but then when you want to go to production, it requires someone else. And vice versa, if I'm the person who has permission to implement in prod, I don't have the ability to implement in non-prod and push things through that haven't been vetted by security and stakeholders and all of your gate reviews. Anywhere that you can segregate the network, whether that's logical or physical, that's a fantastic thing to do. There's a lot of solutions between different routing and access controls and group policies and things, VLANs, VPNs, et cetera, where you can really segment your network and who has access to what. And every time you do that, yes, it adds more administrative headache for you, but it boosts your security significantly. And this is one of those areas that it becomes more about security than it is compliance. Least functionality is covered a little bit in the last one, really looking at kind of one thing that I wanted you to think about or question and go back and talk about. And that's more on the job or role of the device itself. And servers are a great place to start. If I'm a small organization or I manage a small organization and I need a DHCP server, I need a domain controller, and maybe I need, I don't know, a vulnerability scanner. I may have a beefy enough piece of hardware or virtual hardware that I can run all three of those jobs or capabilities or roles on the one device, which means it keeps costs and administration down for me because it's one device to patch, it's one device to pay for, et cetera. The problem with that is that you're not segregating the roles and the capabilities, and therefore when you combine them, you have a difficult time with least privilege and least functionality, because more people are likely to have to touch or use that server in some capacity. There's more pieces of software involved that could potentially introduce vulnerabilities. If compromised, you're not just potentially being compromised on your vulnerability scanner host, you're now being compromised on your domain controller, et cetera. So the job of the folks who have to administer this and ensure that security is implemented and being followed becomes far more difficult because we consolidated our hardware. Again, this becomes a business risk decision because there's a cost potentially involved, and maybe the organization says the cost savings are worth it. In this day and age, it's getting cheaper and cheaper to obviously deploy cloud infrastructures, and for the low cost of these infrastructures, that argument is probably becoming a little more difficult to make unless you're a true startup where every penny counts and you need to go send it somewhere else. But to run a server for $100 a month, for example, in the cloud, and say that I can save $100 by not standing up that second one is probably not an argument that you'll have to fight too much anymore. On the physical side, obviously quite different. You have what you have, and the only way to get more is to go out and provision it. And then not only is it a cost, but do you have the space for it? How long do you plan on staying physical? Maybe you plan to migrate to the cloud. Those kinds of considerations that make it prohibitive. Looking at restricting, disabling, and preventing the use of non-essential programs, functions, ports, protocols, and services. This is a great one. This one, I think most organizations have an idea of what they want to do, a plan for doing it. Some may even have it documented what they want to do and claim to do. But when we do a vulnerability assessment, when we do scans, we come back and we find out that this is not the case. It's not being properly implemented, or it's not being maintained. So some of the questions to be asking yourself is, do you have services and functions that are not in use, but are also not disabled? So you can load up a server, install a bunch of software on it. By default, a bunch of services are running. You have no idea whether you're using them, if you need them, et cetera, and they just run. Well, they should be disabled or installed. Do you have ports and protocols open because your logic is, if I leave them open, I can make sure that I don't break anything in the environment, but then I may have hundreds, if not thousands, of these protocols or ports that are open that I'm not using, I knew I wasn't going to use, and are now another attack vector. Are you denying or allowing by default for network equipment? A lot of our rules and policies that we have on networking appliances, security appliances, are essentially, you could set a deny all, and then you have to manually specify what's allowed, or you can allow all and manually deny. I think most vendors by default, especially on the networking side, will tend to lean towards you have to put in what to allow, and then everything else is a deny. You'll see a lot of statements that say deny any. But on the software side of the house, that may not be the case. You may be more of an allow all, accept what you deny. You'll also want to know whether or not you're allowing auto execute functionality. Can things execute in the environment without permission? Do you employ whitelisting and blacklisting? And I'll speak more to that on a separate slide. But again, whitelisting and blacklisting can be a manual, written, documented kind of process and procedure and policy type effort, or it could be a software-based solution. You'll still have to have all the policy and procedure, but you may automate the actual effort behind it. And then, do you restrict or prevent things like external device connections? And this can be peer-to-peer networking, thumb drives, FTP that's not secure, for example. Any matter of fact, any of your file transfer methods that aren't using a secure protocol. Do you want to allow things like, I would like someone to be able to hook up a Bluetooth speaker, but I don't want them to be able to install a thumb drive where they can copy data? All of these things need to be considered. And again, the business needs to make a decision on what they want to formally allow or disallow. It needs to be documented so that you and your employees know the stance of the organization, and then you can start to look at solutions and costs to actually achieve your goal. So speaking a little more to blacklisting and whitelisting, this one I wanted to pull straight from kind of the NIST document, just because it was easier than me rewording it. But by definition, a blacklist is is a process that stops you from installing unauthorized software. So you come up with what is on the blacklist. If someone tries to install it, it checks the blacklist and it will prevent it. Whitelisting, on the other hand, is what you are going to allow. So I want to allow Zoom because people have to have meetings, and by default, someone tries to load Zoom, it's going to check the whitelist and see it. Whitelisting is the stronger of the two policies for restricting, according to NIST. I like the whitelisting for the fact that you're actively including what you want to be allowed, and you're not having to worry about the things you didn't know about, things that you're unaware of. If you're going with blacklisting, for example, what if I think Zoom and Teams and maybe WebEx are the only programs that someone's going to use to do conferences, and I don't realize that another company just came out with a different piece of software, someone decides to use that software, it's not going to be on the blacklist. Vice versa, if I say I'm only going to allow Zoom or Teams or WebEx, it doesn't matter how many organizations come out with software or how many vendors, and it doesn't matter what anyone tries to install, it won't meet that criteria. So it'll be a much smaller list that you can manage, and that whitelist will then also, it should also equate to virtually a copy of your software asset inventory. So you can be checking that to say, do I own 100 pieces of software, but I only have 50 whitelisted? Whereas if you do the blacklisting, you're not going to have that ability. Integrity of software is a great one to include. If you have a way to check the checksums, digital signatures, and hash functions to make sure it's reputable software from the vendor that's been tested and hasn't been modified through whatever website you might be downloading it, if you're getting it through a forum, third party, etc. But that can all be checked, and it can be checked to make sure that you don't implement malicious software and then blocks it before you even get to that point. And last, controlling and monitoring user installed software. This is another one that's very simple to fix, but very difficult problem to solve because the user environments and the organizations are so different. You need to have policies as to what software is allowed and prohibited, as we've talked about, but also it needs to be documented so your users are aware of what the processes are for requesting, what they're allowed to do and what they can't, so that if they violate the policy, you have a way to uphold it. You also need to, again, look at permissions, which is one of the first things I talked about to determine if you have a problem. If you have people with local admin privileges, as an example, then it doesn't really matter that no one's in the network admin group or sysadmin group in Active Directory, because they already have local admin privileges. So do you have a good handle on local admin? And while this control from a compliance perspective, I believe is really focusing more on the installation of prohibited software, I want to throw in there that I don't think you should forget that with every additional piece of software you permit in your environment, that's one additional program or piece of software that has to be patched, updated, checked for vulnerabilities. You should be monitoring end of life, end of service, etc. So yes, adding the software to the environment may be great for the user, but it could give you 5 additional tasks that you as the administrator and or security professional are now responsible for. So again, with each one of these, consider both the security aspect and the business aspect. Try to present those in the most unbiased manner that you can, and then present the risks and your recommendations to whoever the person or group or board or people are in the organization who ultimately make the decisions. And on that note, that concludes the presentation for today. I don't see any questions in our Q&A chat. So hopefully this information was relevant and helpful to you. And as always, I appreciate you taking time out of your day and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.